My name's Lee Goldberg. It's February 5th, 2009, and I'm interviewing Glen A. Larson for the Archive of American Television in Woodland Hills, California.
The most difficult question.
Ouch.
We're going to ask you the most difficult question first. What was your name at birth?
Glen A. Larson. Well, I never told what the A stood for. Okay, it's Albert.
Albert. And where were you born?
I was born in Long Beach, California,
What year?
1937.
Tell us about your family life. What did your mom do? What did your dad do?
I was born at the beginning of World War II. I mean, plus or minus as I remember my youth. So my father was in the Navy and very quickly disappeared from our scene because he wound up in places like Guadalcanal, which was one of the longest battles in the history of World War II and one of the nastiest. So it fell upon my mother to kind of hold the family together. Moved very early up into the Hollywood area, West Hollywood, and she was from Sweden, born in Blekinge, and worked at a restaurant called the Bit of Sweden. It was very fashionable in those days. It was attended by a lot of celebrities and things, but it was an unfortunate thing to be kind of almost orphaned because I spent a lot of time alone, but it became possibly the foundation of what later became my career because there was a little radio that was my companion, and I fell in love with all the various facets of broadcasting.
Tell me a little bit more about that, about your love for radio.
Well, as a young kid, I remember vividly first wanting to hear the Lone Ranger on the radio because I had heard that you could hear it on the radio, and I think it was a Tuesday night, and the Lone Ranger didn't come on. Red Ryder came on, and said something's wrong. So the next night at the same tune in tomorrow night. So I tuned on the next night, and the Lone Ranger came on. So they used to alternate. I didn't know that, but it was fascinating. I listened to that. Eventually, a kid down the street invited me to go to a live radio broadcast at Sunset and Vine, where NBC had their studios. And it was the Smiling Ed McConnell, Buster Brown gang. And as you walked, that was fascinating. I saw someone talking into a microphone and realized that they could be heard all across the country. And I think they used to transcribe that so you would hear the same broadcast 1 week later or something. Coming out of the broadcast, they handed us tickets to another broadcast. It was the Abbott and Costello Kids Show. I was hooked, from that point forward. I started making clay microphones, at 8 years old or 10 years old. And we used to put radio shows on in our garage that we would get out of a book. I think it was called Best Broadcasts of 1939 or something. And it would have Sam Spade in there, or Fibber McGee and Molly. Those shows that were huge then, Jack Benny.
How old were you when you were doing this?
In grammar school, my friend of mine put on a demonstration of sound effects, that stuff. And we crashing and gunshots and all of those things. Well, how old are you in grammar school? You're 10.
Yeah.
In that, and I used to go stand on the no-ticket line down at Sunset and Vine to get into the shows. Jack Benny, A Man Called X, the Lux Radio Theater. I watched Al Jolson sing because they didn't have Larry Parks do the broadcast because he couldn't do the singing. And young girls from Hollywood High School were in the balcony, and this man must have been in his 80s. And he held an audience in the palm of his hand, and I was struck by this world of broadcasting, and it probably was totally responsible for why I eventually became a student of, and then a practitioner of, and perhaps of some significance in broadcasting. I had that primer, and it was partly my parent, I learned from it.
Your mom encouraged this?
She didn't have a heck of a lot to say about it. She wasn't there. She was working most of the time, as most people were during the war. This was World War II. little remembered now, but it was quite a siege.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
I did not have any brothers or sisters. Some subsequent years later, quite a long time later, my mother remarried, and I have a half brother who is in television. He's a prop master, and he's worked on almost all of Spielberg's movies. He was in the middle of the hurricane on Kauai when they were doing Jurassic Park and things of that sort. So
Where'd you go to high school?
I went to. Some of this is like a press agent sat down and made it up, but I actually did go to Hollywood High School. And in the class ahead of me was David Nelson. In the class behind me was Ricky Nelson. There were no, Yvette Mimieux went there, Sally Kellerman went there. A lot of people who wound up with careers in the business went to Hollywood High School. I eventually had a relationship with a man. I became important in at least 2 or 3 shows, and I met him hitchhiking to Hollywood High School. It was Robert Wagner, and that became the very first television show I ever worked on. I wrote a spec script and went down to the stage and introduced myself. And we've been friends for life, but all started in those formal, primitive days. I mean, we were. I was in a town where broadcasting, had its roots. And,
You're talking about how radio had this big influence on you, but what about motion pictures, books? Were they not as interesting to you?
Well, the one was really accessible to me. And when I was a kid, it was a lot harder for me to go to the movies. Mm-hmm. But we had a couple of theaters locally. Yes, I went to movies and things, but they didn't have near the impact. Nor did they later in my career, where I found that broadcasting, you could write a script, turn it in, cast it, and have it shot and be on the air in 10 weeks. Motion pictures, and I'm still involved with those now. We've had Magnum PI in development for 5 years.
When you were a kid, did you entertain fantasies of going into radio?
Well, radio made the transition as I grew up, so that when I was in junior high school, television came in and became the dominant medium. And it was sad to see radio kind of trickle out, but a lot of the shows made the transition. Lucille Ball, I Love Lucy, was my favorite husband on radio, and I went to see it as a kid, and I think that was with Richard Denning. And I just learned storytelling from that world and the world of having to do it in your lifetime. You don't have years to get an episode ready.
So what elements of storytelling do you think you learned from radio?
The basics of drama, melodrama, and radio was such an incredibly underrated form, I would say today, to today's audience, because they don't realize what you contributed as an audience to the radio show, because it was your imagination that would take these words and just a few sound effects and a little music and translate them into major motion pictures in your head. Much harder to do later in television to create these worlds, because you actually had to build the sets and you had to pay the money, and it was quite a different thing. I learned storytelling, I learned casting, I learned timing, just all kinds of things that are subtle, but you learn them.
Did your fascination with radio transfer to the new medium of television? Were you as avid about TV as you were about radio?
One of the first things I did, while holding all kinds of different jobs, is we did not come from a wealthy family. I worked at Ralph's grocery store as a box boy, as a cashier. I sold papers in the middle of what is now the Beverly Center here in Los Angeles, in the middle of the street, with the Herald Express and the Daily News. First chance I got a job at NBC as a page. And I just loved being in and around it all. And they would do the live dramas. They would bring, they did Lux Video Theater at that point. They did matinee theater every day, a 1-hour drama every day in color. and an amazing experience to be in live television, to be in the booth, to watch him. I became involved in singing. I had an interest in Glee Club, whatever, and I remember being a page at NBC, and Tennessee Ernie Ford took a liking to our group. We'd get to that later, but I was on the stage singing on the first part of the show, and as the show broke, I had to run and get into my NBC page uniform, and I was standing on the corner handing out tickets for Queen for a Day as the audience left the theater.
Well, let's talk about, you're into radio, you're into storytelling, and yet you broke into the industry really not as a writer, but as a singer.
Well, in high school, I was writing things. I wrote ideas for series.
Radio series or TV series?
TV series. The radio was pretty much gone by then. It was all television. But writing, I did have an affinity for it. It was the hardest thing you can do in the world, sit down with a blank piece of paper. But while doing that and trying to sell a few things, we did a few shows. We started a group. I think we really put the group together because they were having a talent show at Hollywood High School, and only girls were coming out to be in the show. There were no guys going to be in it for whatever reason. I think we decided that's why we wanted to be on the show, because that's where the girls were. So we formed a group called the Four Preps, and somewhere in this room there's a picture up there of the four of us standing on the stage, and we took some tapes to UCLA for a co-op, and we met a guy who was just lived around the corner. He managed a group, Les Paul and Mary Ford, who were huge on Capitol Records. And the producer of Les Paul and Mary Ford was also the producer Frank Sinatra. Had brought him back from virtually the dead when he had left Columbia Records and was practically out of the business until he did a huge movie, From Here to Eternity, which he won the Academy Award for. Voyle Gilmore brought him to Capitol, and Voyle listened to our tape, this really, pretty simple tape that we had made at this co-op, and he said, "You want to be on Capitol Records?" Yeah, it didn't take long to say yes to that, and so we went down and we sang a few songs, and the very first song we sang got a little attention around the country. It's called Dreamy Eyes. Not one of my favorites. In retrospect, I've listened to it later. It wasn't so bad. We went through about 5 records and then did a song that Bruce and I in the group wrote called 26 Miles to Santa Catalina. And that took off.
For the record, the Four Preps were who with the names?
At that time, it was Marvin Ingram, Bruce Belland, Ed Cobb, and Glen Larson. And the personnel changed a little once in a while over the years, but that's what we started. And our second record in that group was a big hit called Big Man. And we went on the road, and we were on Ed Sullivan a bunch of times.
Was that your first TV appearance?
I think our first TV appearance was, before we had a hit record, we actually were invited to be on a show called the Edsel Show. Don't laugh. Don't snicker. We introduced a new car called the Edsel. And I don't know if we had anything to do with killing it, but first and last Edsel hour. But it was Bing Crosby, Rosemary Clooney, Frank Sinatra, Louis Armstrong, and the Four Preps. I don't know how we got that billing. We were really backing Lindsey Nelson, his son, Bing Crosby's son. Anyway, we did that, and then we did a lot of Dick Clark shows and Ed Sullivan shows.
What was it like doing Ed Sullivan and Dick Clark?
Well, we developed a great relationship with Dick. I had my first solo in the group, and the audience is laughing, and I don't know why. And Dick Clark is on his hands and knees, and you've seen that kind of plastic stuff that's supposed to resemble something unmentionable on the air. It's if you're either ill or you have a dog or whatever. He pushed this stuff out in front, right underneath me, and I'm convinced that my fly's open because the audience is screaming, and the guys around me are not. Of course, those are lip syncs when you do Dick Clark. I don't know what's wrong. But anyway, things like that went on all the time. We sent Dick Clark. We found a fish down on the banks of the Allegheny River. They were breaking in a new radio station upstate New York, and we later sent him one in the mail, and apparently it destroyed their offices for weeks. So we had these running gags that would go on, and again, it's broadcasting. We're doing live stuff, and I start taking my typewriter with me because as we got more and more successful, we were on the road longer and longer. We helped pioneer what was called the college concert circuit. It really hadn't been big before then. And it got down to, because we did an in-person album which we dedicated to President Kennedy, and it was about drafting all the other groups into the Peace Corps. And it made us a college concert album. A college concert act. And we recorded it at a high school in California, but it said recorded on live in Southern California. Everyone assumed it was USC. It became a huge album, and you either bought Peter, Paul, and Mary or the Four Preps. And we were traveling and traveling. It was wonderful, but there comes a point. So I started taking my typewriter with me, and a small Sony 4-inch. I would sit on an airplane watching The Fugitive, so I wouldn't miss an episode. And then I would write a spec story or script, and I sent it in. And one day they sent it back. They wanted to buy it.
Let me ask you though. Here you were, a hit group.
Yeah.
Why did you hang on so intently to the idea of writing? Why not just ride the music train to the...
I had a desire to do both. First of all, it's hard to be one of four guys. As life gets more complicated, you're introduced to that other gender called women. They have an influence on groups that is profound. There are probably stories about groups bigger than us, bigger than ours, that ran into those. Any two of them would get along, wives, girlfriends. You get a third one along, and the two would ostracize the third. And why don't you go out on your own? This kinds of stuff start. But more than that, you also find yourself traveling all over the world. And when we were done doing a lot of concerts, we would start doing more military bases everywhere, from Germany to Saigon to all over the world. And you get to a point where you say, I'd really like to kind of harness my life a little bit. And I was introduced by Henry Mancini, because we did some concerts with him, to one of the big guys at Universal. And he said, "Do you have any ideas?" So I wrote a story, and we're still doing concerts, but I wrote a story, and they said, "Great, this will make a fabulous TV show. We'll get a really good writer to write it, and we'll be on our way." And I really kind of wanted to write that myself, but that wasn't in the cards, so they gave it to someone. It died.
Well, let's get back to that first freelance script. You said you sold your first script to The Fugitive?
Yeah, the first story, I wrote a script, but they bought the story.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did the same thing for 12 O'Clock High. They bought the story. They read the script, bought the story. But that's because when you're young and you're starting out, structure is the hardest thing to come to you. You may have good dialogue, you may have some good ideas, but learning the structure and how to make it all work takes a little more time. So, those steps encouraged me to know that somewhere down the line that could become a career. And it was while doing the preps and still being very heavily in the music business. But you go after a period of time. We didn't have any hit records for a little while, and then we went into because we were going to get drafted. All of us joined the Air National Guard together, and we thought, it's pretty clever. Now we don't get drafted. Then I'm at a church picnic, and President Kennedy announces that they're activating all the National Guard units. So we're all going on active duty for 2 years, or whatever it's going to be. Mm-hmm. This was for the Berlin crisis. So our group went into the service as a unit. And that took a big chunk out of our careers. And, by the time that thing was over, our career was a little cooler and a little this and so forth. So it starts to overlap, and I started getting more and more interested in finding that career for myself where I could, by this time I had gotten married, and a number of those children come along, and you don't see them when you're on the road all the time. And so I had a definite interest in trying to refocus on broadcasting.
What was your first big sale that, in your mind, brought you into the TV business? You'd sold the story to 12 O'Clock High and The Fugitive. What was your first?
One of the worst
screenplay?
experiences of my life was I sold a story to Run for Your Life. And it was a pretty darn good story. I suggested that he get his money cut off. And he has a run-in with the mafia or something. They just cut off his money. Now, it's great in that series where he could travel anywhere in the world and have all these adventures and things. And the money cut off, he can't move, he can't do anything. He has to go after the mafia. The guy, I get a go-ahead. I think we were singing in Denver at the time. I got the go-ahead. I write a story, and on Christmas Eve, the guy calls me and said, "We're cutting you off." I said, "Couldn't this have waited till the day after Christmas or after New Year's?" And he said, "Well, we've decided to take over the story ourselves and write it." That was for Roy Huggins, but he's not the one who called me. The next time I said that I had an idea that I really wanted to do, I would write the script myself, and I would not go through the story process and whatever. So I wrote one for It Takes a Thief, which I thought was a great idea. And it turns out that it was a winter sale, and everyone was at home writing scripts for the show. So I wrote a script. I brought it into a guy they had just brought in to do 2 shows. He had been really the force behind Star Trek, Gene Coon, and even more than Roddenberry. I mean, he took over the show, and I would say its second season, it was the best season, whatever. He was the one who was working with Harlan Ellison and all those people. And I brought it in, and they had asked me, they knew I'd been disappointed by selling them 2 concepts, which they gave to other people to write. So they let me go around and meet a few producers and try to get started. I handed him this script, and he says, "Has anybody else seen it?" And I said, no. No, excuse me, I told him the idea. And he said, "I can't buy it. I've only been hired to do 2 scripts, but if that script were on my desk Monday morning in any way, shape, or form, I would buy it." So I went home and said, "I'm going to write this one for me, the way I want to do it, the way I'd like to do it, and have as much fun as I could with it." And I put it on the desk Monday morning with 2 different endings, which I guess you don't normally do, but 2 different little ways to finish it. And a few hours went by, they called and they offered me the job as story editor on the show. So we had one more big tour coming up in Asia. We were going to go to Vietnam and Bangkok and places like that. And they bought that one, and I got to watch them shoot that before I left with Robert Wagner. And the next one was a 2-parter, and I wrote it on airplanes in the middle of the Vietnam War and the whole thing. We were traxing down runways with fighter planes on both sides of the airstrip with sandbags around them. It was surreal as could be. And I'm writing about this international thief working for the CIA, and it.
Well, let me take you 2 steps back. When you sold your first stories to Fugitive and 12 O'Clock High, how did you even get in the door? I mean, here you were in the music business. How did you get into the producers of those shows with your concepts?
The director of, that personal manager I told you handled Peter, Paul, and Mary, he had another client named Bill Gordon. And Bill Gordon was a very successful writer. And he was story editor on the Richard Boone Show. He became producer of 12 O'Clock High. So he was an entree. He would read my material, critique it, give it back to me. And in the case of two of the things, The Fugitive and 12 O'Clock High, he was the one who bought the material, albeit not to put on the air, but to rewrite it.
Mhm.
And one contact will often lead to another. And I don't recall how I first found my way into Roy Huggins' office, but there was a gentleman who worked for him called Bob Hamner, who had been a press agent in New York and was working on the show. And I guess I made my pitch to him, paragraph, gave it to Roy. Obviously, when you're looking for new material for a show that's been going on a couple of years, cutting his money off so he couldn't go anyplace, do anything without a huge fight was an automatic. They just didn't really want me to do it. They just wanted the idea, and so.
And where did you learn the form, the screenplay form at the time for an hour-long episodic show?
I collected scripts from the time I was a really small kid, and I don't know if Mel got me copies of certain things, but the format is not hard to find. That's one of the easiest things in the world. What to put onto the page is the problem, and if you work it right, it's the most fun you can have. It's the trauma of getting started and getting through those first hurdles when it's nothing but failure that's tough to overcome.
So let's get back. You got this job on It Takes a Thief overnight, it seems, going from freelancer to story editor. What did it involve being story editor? What were your responsibilities and interactions with other members of the staff?
Well, it's harder than I imagined, because I was thrilled to be there. You know, I thought it was great. And there's a few writers. There used to, TV Guide used to put the name of the writer on every episode. That went away somewhere along the line. But there were a few guys I was keeping track of who wrote what episodes. And script would come in written by one of these people, and I'd look at it and say, wow, and I'd read it, and I'd say, gee, this is really good. And Gene Cood said, is it? And I said, yeah, that's a pretty good script. And he said, what did you think about such and such? And I said, well, yeah, that was kind of questionable. There was a little hole there, yeah. And what about when he did that and coincidentally figured out? And I said, yeah, those were problems. He said, excuse me, but your job is to find those holes and things, not me. You're supposed to find those and fix them. That's your job as story editor, or get the writer to fix them if he doesn't argue too hard. And so I realized that I had to, work a little harder at that. I wound up on It Takes a Thief. I think they made 65 episodes. I think I wrote 26 of them and rewrote another 13 or 14 of them. I love the show, and I learned that process. But again, it didn't slow down. After about half a season, another guy in the lot said, how would you like to come across to a show called Fame Is the Name of the Game? And it was a 90-minute show with a wheel. It was 3 different stars. Robert Stack, it was about a magazine empire. Robert Stack did crime.
There's Tony Franciosa.
Tony Franciosa
and Gene Barry.
did People, which actually became the name of the magazine. And the head of the whole empire, Glen.
It was Gene Barry.
Gene Barry, who subsequently did Broadway and a lot of other things. So those 3, it was their stories, and each week they do a 90-minute. And Leslie Stevens was doing the Franciosa show. He says, how'd you like to come over here on our show and be a story editor? And I'll try to work it around so one day you'll be producing. And I really liked him. He was a tremendous talent, and he had worked on It Takes a Thief. He was one of the guys that was there when I went in, and they had handed him this new show. So I went to the powers that be up in the tower. I think it was Frank Price at that time. And I said, I've been offered a real chance to graduate and go over to, and he said, no, that's a different group of executives up here. You're working on my show, but it is a great opportunity. So we'll give you a chance to produce one, like right now, out of this next batch of shows. I said, I can produce one? So within the lot at Universal, you had this competition between networks. One guy represented ABC, one did NBC, one did CBS. And, you got in the right spot, and you were in this they were competing for your services, and I was pretty new. But I did take that shot, and I produced my very first episode. And again, Bob Wagner was was on the show, and so I went from story editor to producer in one season.
What was your relationship like with Robert Wagner? Obviously, it's one that's endured, but what was it like in that very early stage?
It was the first script I wrote was very funny. It had a lot of really good stuff in it. Looking back, I could point out to some things that I wouldn't say were as good as that. It really was a good script, and we developed an immediate relationship because they were looking for scripts desperately. They went on there in January, with no scripts, and so the very first thing they wanted to do was take the show to Italy for maybe 8 episodes, and I had gotten into television to get off the road, to stop traveling, to try to meet my children and my wife. The first thing they wanted to do was take the show to Italy, and so I said, well, we had 2 associate producers, both of which had been given one shot to produce. I said he could go to Italy, and I could be preparing the shows for as soon as I get back. And I had developed kind of a pretty good rapport with Bob. He said, nah, I'd really like, you to go. So it's like the Army. If you don't want to do something, that's where they send you. But it was one of the great experiences of my life to go and shoot in Venice and Rome, and we took so and we
wasn't
brought,
Fred Astaire on those episodes?
I was about to say we brought. Bob had this idea. Let's bring in Fred Astaire's my father, Alistair Mundy. And it was Al Mundy, and Alistair became his father. So we did some really interesting episodes with that. An important story right at this time was that Bob started in a mansion in which they had guards around and video surveillance. So in the first season, getting out by putting test patterns up and crazy things was part of the fun. Second season, he really lobbied to get his own apartment. He wanted this lavish, really great pad in downtown Washington. So, they take a sound stage and they make it beautiful. Then they find a building that it looks like it could fit in. And remember, this is a thief released from prison by the SIA to spy. So, you don't want me to spy, you want me to steal? Or maybe we went the other way around. We don't want you to spy, Al, we want you to steal. So the building they picked to be his headquarters, and I don't know if anybody's ever noticed this before. I didn't say a lot about it at the time, but they picked the Watergate. So our SIA thief is living in the Watergate, which turned out to be somewhat a interesting coincidence somewhat later in Washington history. But in any case, we went to Italy, we did some wonderful shows, and one of the happiest times of my life, although I didn't really get to see anything of Italy. We had no scripts there either, so I was in a closet in the hotel just cranking out pages every day, much the way you hear that Casablanca was written. You keep sending pages to the set. But a great experience, and Bob and I became friends for life based on this, this camaraderie.
So you went from It Takes a Thief to producing a Name of the Game episode
I didn't
with
go
Robert
to Name
Wagner?
of the Game.
Oh, yeah.
I that leverage got me my producing star on It Takes a Thief, and then it just went on from that to the next show and so forth.
So did Universal sign you at this point to an overall deal?
Yes. They signed me on the basis of that first script. And that was my exodus from the group. Within the group, 2 of our guys, Dave Somerville had come over to our group from a group called the Diamonds. And they were a huge group. They did a song called Little Darling, which most raconteurs, aficionados of rock and roll will remember is one of the great records of all time. He and Bruce had a real affinity for maybe doing a Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis type thing, where they'd sing and do a lot of comedy. So the timing was such that it was perfect time for me to bow out of the group, even though I was sort of the spokesman and did a lot of the organizing of the act, and make my transition and roll the dice, as it were, because who knew where that would go.
You were part of a pretty auspicious group of young writers at Universal at the time. There was Michael Gleason, Dean Hargrove, Steve Cannell, Stephen Bochco. Were you all aware of one another? Were you all...
Sure. It was, in television, you're all pretty busy. This is not like the days of Hollywood film writers where they'd all get together at lunch and talk about their problems and trade, input for their scripts. We rarely ran into each other, once in a while, but we were all busy grinding out these shows. Television is a 20-hour day job. It's an enormous drain on you. But I brought in Michael Gleason to do McCloud. He had done a show there, but it hadn't worked out. I think that was with Lana Turner and then George Hamilton. Bochco, remember what he was working on at the time, but we overlapped. Dean Hargrove was on It Takes a Thief. Lincoln Levinson was a prominent writing team at that time, and they were classy guys. They had actually put the McCloud pilot together.
We'll get to McCloud a little bit later. Let's go back a little bit to It Takes a Thief. You finished that show. What was your next assignment? Was it The Virginian?
My next assignment was to go back to Leslie Stevens, who had offered me Famous the Name of the Game, and he was given 2 shows. He was given a remake or a modification of The Virginian. The Virginian had been very successful for 5-6 years, I don't know. And they wanted to call it The Men from Shiloh and modernize it a little more in the Butch Cassidy, a little more contemporary, updated Western. And at the same time, they gave him one group of a show called The 4-in-1. Each show would do 6 episodes. And one was The Psychiatrist, one was SFO, I think, which was the San Francisco International Airport, based loosely on airport. One was McCloud, and one was Night Gallery. So I suddenly I'm on 2 shows. I'm writing for the Doug McClure segments of Men from Shiloh and McCloud.
And McCloud, was that based on the Coogan's Bluff movie?
Yeah, it was a very complicated thing. It came to Universal as a television show. They decided to bump it over and make it into a movie, and they made Coogan's Bluff. Then after that was enormously successful with Clint Eastwood, they decided to make a TV show out of it again. There was a lot of guild, arbitrations on that one.
So McCloud, though, was a major turning point for you. You made a lot of relationships on that show that would continue for quite some time. And also it was a 90-minute series as opposed to 60 minutes. Can you talk a little bit about making the transition from doing an hour-long weekly show to doing a 90-minute movie?
Yeah, the fun of McCloud, well, first of all, it started as a 1-hour show. And when the 4-in-1 was over, they chose a couple to go forward with. One was Night Gallery, which was Rod Serling, and the other one was McCloud. And I had done one episode of McCloud, writing it, and they gave it to Dean Hargrove. And he did it as part of the NBC mystery movie, which was called, I think, the Wednesday Night Movie. And he took a different tack with the show. He took a tack where McCloud would sit around headquarters and they would just send the kooks to him. He would talk to people with funny hats. And my feeling was that if you're going to do it, they really should do it if you had John Wayne or Clint Eastwood in New York. And they wouldn't want to give him the time of day because I don't want to be bothered with a guy who came from Taos to learn big city techniques. So they would not assign him anything, but he would horn his way into, the big murder in Manhattan and walk in. And if he asked, they had him asking all kinds of questions. They really had him doing Columbo, because Lincoln Levinson had created Columbo and Dean Hargrove had worked on Columbo. So he would be standing around the door and saying, "Yeah, golly, I just kind of wonder." Well, he was doing Chester from Gunsmoke. what he should have been doing is asking if it's one question, it's the right question. And it would propel him to the next stage of the episode. Now, this kind of started a career MO for me. And we recall, as a kid, I would watch sitcoms and I'd watch dramas and so forth. I developed sort of a style that isn't sitcom. I call it predicament humor. You don't do anything that cuts your star off at the knees or worse. You make him intelligent. You give him great ideas and great things to do, but sometimes things happen. Circumstances go wrong, and if he's out there with a police car he had to commandeer, something goes wrong with it, and the chief is yelling at him the next moment, and pretty soon something. By the time you get to Act 4, he comes in with a steering wheel from his third car, and he's in trouble, but the audience is looking forward to it. And I found that if you could find a way to put a little humor in a lot of these shows, it elevated them a little bit more to what we expect from movie making when you get into detective shows and things like that. There's more style in it, and I enjoyed that, and it served me very well later when I wanted to do a concept that everyone had tried. And Frank Price told me he had tried to develop 8 times, and he wanted to do huge things, Gandhi and Stripes and all those things as head of Columbia and all that. He said, you'll have a hard time licking that concept. And it was also going to be put into the mystery movie. And the concept turned out to be Quincy.
We'll get to Quincy a little bit later.
But I'm just telling the chronology of how it's humor that made it possible to do a show about dead bodies.
With McCloud, let me make sure I got the hierarchy right. Dean Hargrove was running the show, if that was the term
No,
that used?
he was running when they made it the Wednesday night mystery movie, Dean had the McCloud segment. Things were not going. They were doing Columbo. Mm-hmm. Columbo was already in that wheel, and so it really wasn't what it could have been. And Dean's a very talented writer. I mean, but the shows we had done in the 4 and 1 was what NBC had really wanted, and they said if I would come and do that show as my first show by myself, with no other bosses and no other things, they would pick it up for another season. And that was a very generous offer, because I'd never had the show with full responsibility. And I looked around for someone to work on that show with me, and I had seen a couple of episodes that Michael Gleason had written, I think for Canon. And he wrote with wit and style. And I remember someone trying to talk me out of, bringing on anyone else. He says, you're in charge. Why do you want to? Well, first of all, these are 90-minute movies, and you can use a little writing help. But we got together, and we go to New York to take to meet with the police department and find out if there really are any big city techniques that McCloud could learn from, because they had him doing kooky stuff. Mm-hmm. We figured, well, they must be doing some things. It turns out that the government had many programs that were very interesting. Neighborhood Watch, and they had something with bugs that would turn colors if they came in contact with drugs or explosives. And so we found wonderful opportunities. And then we found a guy who said, wouldn't it be great if you used the New York Mounted Police? And he was the head of the Mounted Police. He's a captain. I said, great, that's a great idea. And I said, Michael, write a story on the Mounted Police. So we write the story, and we're going to shoot it. And we get a call, and they said, we just got a call from the boys in New York, and there's a captain back there who's pretty unhappy. Hasn't got a check yet for his script. And I said, well, a check for his script? I said, he didn't write a script. He's head of he says, no, you don't understand. He said, the boys are unhappy. And I won't go into detail about who they called on the lot, but there were people who knew the boys, and they said, if I were you, I wouldn't want to turn on my ignition for until we get this settled about what we're going to pay the captain for his script. And I hung up the phone, and Michael said, "What was that all about?" He says, "I don't know, but it sounds to me like you're in a lot of trouble."
When did you?
Became a running gag for a long time. He was paid an amount of money for his script, not by us, by the studio. We weren't in charge of money.
When did you bring in Michael Sloan? Was that in the early days?
That's
too?
quite a bit later.
Oh, okay.
That's quite a bit later. It'd take me a minute to. He might have done a McLeod actually, because we developed a relationship that went on for quite a long time. But Michael stayed with me through the advent of the $6 Million Man. They had a pilot called Cyborg, which failed, and I wrote a new concept, based on the same book, but called it the $6 Million Man.
Well, let's go back to McLeod a little bit first. What's your relationship like with Dennis Weaver?
Excellent. Dennis is it's going to sound boring to say, well, I like all these guys. No, we can get to one or two that that we'll want to do some excising. But Dennis was terrific. These are guys that appreciated good scripts. They were there. They were on set. Dennis had paid his dues. He'd done a lot of great work. He was an actor's actor, and he loved the role. Only thing I had to do with Dennis, and is, it's like I'm, not Mr. Was it David Niven or Cary Grant, and I shouldn't tell people how to deal with women. But Dennis was so thrilled not to be Chester or be working with a bear in Gentle Ben that, we would put him he had this wonderful running love affair with Chris Coughlin, this beautiful writer. And if as a beautiful woman walked by, he would tend to lunge at them, and I'd have to say, Dennis, you have to make them come to you. This is a different character now, and we kidded about a lot of that stuff. But he loved that role. We lost Dennis not very long ago, and his dear wife said that, and everybody was at the funeral, and including people who had done a number of other shows with him, but it was always his favorite show. And you'll notice that somewhere in the room up here is a bust of Dennis Weaver. It's one of the better pieces of poetry or pottery or whatever you want to call it, statuary that I've ever seen. Some guy at Arrowhead did it, and we both had houses up there. But no, I love Dennis. I love him very much. And,
tell me a little bit about your relationship with J.D. Cannon and Terry Carter, two more people you'd be working with again in the future.
It's hard to describe relationships in the sense that they were largely professional. I was a huge fan of J.D. Cannon's. I think from Cooled Hand Luke was the first time I saw him in something that I just thought was terrific. He's a very tough actor to get your hands on if he were doing episodic of some kind. He just, was just a very special actor. When McLeod came along and Leslie hired him for the series, he became the anchor of so many of our, what I will call our jokes. I mean, they can be serious situations, but they are the richness of the series. And McLeod, get in here. That it was always, he was always in trouble, and he was just a migraine headache for J.D. Cannon, and J.D. Cannon played it so well that there was never a question of. The problem was that we wanted to give him so much stuff that you'd get complaints from other quarters. But in any case, Terry, again, Leslie cast the original show, and I inherited. They weren't all in the 2-hour pilot, but they were in the 4-in-1 series we did. Terry, I went on to use many times because he's just a solid actor. Again, he made a wonderful foil. He could just sit there and realize that whatever McLeod had just done was going to get him at least 2 ranks of demotion and whatever. So McLeod would take everyone down with him. But we tried to do serious stories too. I mean, this was not a sitcom, but just a great cast.
Were you on the show for its whole run, or?
Yes, yes. It caused problems later with other shows that I was starting up, and you don't walk away from people that trust you and that are, you're very much a part of a television family. But yes, I was with it. I was, once I came back to take that show over, I was with it through till I left the studio, and it went off the air. It came back to do some little stuff later, but and I wasn't involved in those.
How did Alias Smith and Jones come about?
At the point I had gotten my first show, I was obviously interested in developing other ideas, and an idea that we had done on the Men from Shiloh, and it had to do, I think we called it Love Bullets and Valentines or something. It had to do with some outlaws and some things that were going on. And television networks are a lot like automobile manufacturers or anyone else who's in commerce. If something out there catches on with the public, it could be the Mercedes grill, and the Japanese decide to make a luxury car. Sometimes, amazingly, the grill will look a lot like another grill, and I guess you could call it market research. But you can go in and pitch one idea to a network, and they'll say, what we'd really like is something that's a little more like this or whatever. That's why you'll often find a lot of television shows that will resemble movies. And I mean, when I was very young, I remember Love on a Rooftop came along with Peter Duell, who went to work in my first series that you're talking about now. But he was there was Barefoot in the Park, like cookie cut. It was just almost identical. Well, we did a show called Alias Smith and Jones, which was certainly in the genre of Butch Cassidy, the new wave Western. And you could include in that, what's the William Holden movie?
The Wild Bunch.
The Wild Bunch. And those are all about the same group, by the way. The Wild Bunch is the group that Butch Cassidy ran up in Hole in the Wall, and they were the Hole in the Wall gang. All of these things were the coming of age of the more contemporary Western, moving out of the post-Civil War period into just pre-automobile or concurrent, just the changing of the West. And I had meetings with ABC to talk 2 or 3 areas. The one they wanted to go forward with right away was Alias Smith and Jones, and that became my first series. And I wrote a script, and I was, we went to pilot, and it became it was picked up by ABC right away. It just was very attractive. But I had done McCloud, but this was the first time I had come out of a box with a show that I was putting together. Frank Price was my executive producer on that show, and he had not yet quite become one of the cornerstones of the studio. That is, one of the guys who ran one of the networks, as was Grant Tinker and Sid Sheinberg and so forth. It's hard for me to recall exactly what went wrong, but for some reason, Frank's father-in-law was Roy Huggins. Roy Huggins was Mr. Maverick. And I must say, growing up and on the road in my early days, Maverick was my favorite show. I loved the tongue-in-cheek, the humor of it. And we were looking for that element. And in launching a brand new show, I think there was some concerns whether or not I could handle it.
Even after McCloud, which you'd proven there?
Yeah. Boy, that was my position. What are you talking about? I know what I'm doing. However, Frank didn't feel we had a focus yet on the show and exactly what it was going to be and so forth and so on. We're going to stop her, but we got a cat meowing here and it's going to